J.D. Vance stepped out of his car, thinking that tonight was just a light meal to shake off the fatigue after a long day. But then, a small trembling voice rising from the darkness pulled him into a story he never expected, a story that would change both him and the people he met. It was an early winter evening in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. The season's cold was unforgiving, seeping through every thin layer of clothing, clinging to the skin like icy needles. The sidewalk in front of a small eatery called Tom's Roadhouse appeared in the dim glow of street lamps, where old pickup trucks were parked tightly together, their windshields fogged with condensation from the warmth of the cabin, a stark contrast to the harsh weather outside. Inside Tom's Roadhouse, the space seemed to come alive with its own rhythm. The gentle clinking of cutlery, the lively chatter of laborers finishing their shifts, mingled with the rich aroma of grilled beef on the barbecue, freshly roasted coffee, and bread just out of the oven. Yet just outside the large glass door, where the warm yellow light of the eatery spilled out, a little girl stood silently like a shadow, her thin hands clutching the worn strap of a battered backpack to the point of fraying. Perhaps she was not even 10 years old, her small face smudged with street dust, her cheeks flushed red from the biting cold, and her oversized coat enveloping her tiny frame as if it were trying to swallow her whole. The excessively long sleeves concealed her hands completely, the frayed edges adding to her fragile appearance. Yet the girl neither complained nor pleaded. She just stood there, her wide eyes silently watching the passing crowd, as if waiting for a glimmer of fragile hope. J.D. Vance pushed open the door and stepped out, his breath turning into white puffs in the chilly air. He pulled up his coat collar, still carrying a hint of warmth from inside the eatery and the faint smell of coffee clinging to the fabric. His evening had been nothing remarkable, just a simple meal, a few exchanges with a college friend, and now it was time to return to his car, to end a long day. But just as he was about to head toward the parking lot, a small figure caught his eye. The girl was not looking at him. Her gaze was fixed intently on the food container he held, a paper box, still warm, containing half a cheeseburger and a few leftover fries from dinner. He stopped and observed how her small lips moved slightly, as if about to swallow, then pressed together immediately, as if afraid to reveal the hunger roaring inside her. This was the moment that most people would let pass. A fleeting glance, a hint of hesitation, and then hurrying away with the familiar thought, "I'm in a rush. Surely someone will help her. Maybe she doesn't really need it." But J.D. did not do that. He stepped closer, his leather shoes clicking softly on the damp sidewalk. Only then did the girl look up. Her eyes shone with a complex mix of emotions, a clear display of hunger, unmistakable wariness, and something deeper. Not exactly fear, yet not trust either. Just a fragile, easily shattered glimmer of hope. "Excuse me?" Her voice was so soft it almost seemed carried away by the wind. "Do you have any extra food? I don't need much." Her words were gentle, yet cautious, as if she were accustomed to being rejected, ignored too many times. J.D. took a slow breath and bent down so that his eyes met hers at eye level. Up close, he noticed the faint smudges on her forehead and her trembling hands gripping the backpack straps so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. He did not rush to respond. Not because he hesitated to help, but because he understood that this was not just about a meal. This was a moment that would define how one faces compassion when no one is watching. "What's your name?" he asked, his deep, warm voice sounding more like an invitation than an interrogation. The girl hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, a few strands of disheveled hair blown across her face. "I'm Emily," she finally whispered, the sound so soft that he had to strain to hear it. J.D. nodded, smiling gently to ease her tension. "Emily, have you eaten anything today?" The girl's shoulders tensed slightly, a nearly unconscious gesture to hide the truth. Not really," she replied timidly. He glanced toward Tom's Roadhouse, where the neon open sign flickered on the glass, its faint red light reflecting on the concrete below. His hand tightened around the food box, but instead of handing it to her and walking away, he decided to do something different. "Come with me," he said, standing up straight, his voice firm yet not overbearing. "I'll get you a hot meal, all right?" Emily's eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of astonishment and suspicion. as if his words were too unfamiliar for her world. The girl hesitated, her eyes glancing toward the dark parking lot, as if waiting for someone to appear and assure her that everything would be okay. JD did not rush her, patiently holding the door wide open. The warmth from inside spilled out, carrying with it the rich aroma of melting butter and sizzling grilled meat from the pan. For a moment, Emily stood still. Then she stepped forward, moving slowly, as if afraid that this was all just a dream. As they stepped inside, the cold outside was pushed back by a wave of warm air that enveloped them both. Emily shivered slightly at the sudden change, but said nothing, only clutching her backpack tighter, her eyes lowered as if fearful that she did not belong there. JD scanned the restaurant, looking for an empty corner table amidst the still lively atmosphere. Families were laughing together over late dinners, and a few truck drivers were quietly conversing at the bar, all forming a vivid portrait of everyday life, from which Emily seemed so distinctly detached. Inside Tom's Roadhouse, the atmosphere remained as warm and bustling as that of any roadside diner in Portland, Oregon on a chilly November evening. A waitress, her eyes sunken from a long shift, quietly poured more coffee into the cup of a man clad in a worn knit coat. No one paid any mind to them amid the steady flow of passers-by. JD Vance led the little girl Emily to a small wooden table near the window, where the neon light from outside cast flickering beams across the foggy glass. He courteously pulled out a chair for her and then sat down across from her. Emily sat up straight, stiff as though she were waiting for someone to come by and coldly order her to leave. JD noticed this from the way her tiny hands lay motionless on her lap, her fingers clenched tightly as if trying to hide her worry, her whole body as tense as a drawn bow. Another waitress approached, clutching a crumpled notebook between rough, calloused fingers. She raised her head slightly and asked in an even tone, "What would you like to order, sir?" JD offered a gentle smile and motioned toward Emily. "Order whatever you'd like, sweetheart." Emily hesitated, her big eyes reflecting a hint of confusion. To her, food was usually nothing more than scraps discarded by others, things no one wanted. The idea of choosing from a menu seemed too distant. "Anything is fine," JD said in a warm, encouraging tone. "Don't be shy, just tell me." The little girl's lips parted slightly, yet no sound emerged. Recognizing her awkwardness, the waitress softened her voice. "How about a burger? It's really good." Emily blinked, then nodded gently. "Could I have some fries with it?" "Certainly," the waitress replied. "And would you like something to drink, dear?" The little girl pondered for a moment, before softly saying, "Chocolate milk, please." JD smiled. A first for him, to see her speak without hesitation, as if a small door had just been ajar in her heart. After the waitress walked away, Emily lowered her head, her fingers lightly gliding over the scratched surface of the wooden table, marks that bore silent witness to countless past stories. The space between them fell silent, broken only by the clatter of dishes and the murmured conversations from other tables. JD waited patiently before gently asking, "Emily, where is your mom?" The little girl's finger paused on an invisible line as her eyes remained fixed on the table. "At the community support center," she replied in a voice so soft it seemed afraid someone might overhear. He let it be, hoping she might share more, but Emily remained silent. "And what about your dad?" JD continued, his tone still gentle. The girl's hand tightened on the strap of her backpack, her knuckles turning pale. "I don't really know anymore." JD observed her, each small gesture revealing more than words ever could. "How long have you been at that center?" Emily shrugged. "It's been a long time." Her voice was even, but her eyes shone with a resignation that no 10-year-old should bear, as though she had long come to see hope as a luxury. Leaning back in his chair, JD's gaze grew pensive. He understood that feeling, growing up amid precarious days, always wondering if life would ever cease its trials, masking hunger with forced smiles and carrying burdens far beyond childhood. But for Emily, this wasn't just a fleeting hard time. It was deeper, like a lingering wound. The tension in the air began to ease as the waitress returned, carrying a large plate, a fragrant burger with melted cheese oozing over it, a pile of golden, crispy fries, and a glass of frothy chocolate milk. Emily sat a little straighter, her eyes lighting up for an instant. She didn't wait long. Her small hands hurriedly lifted the burger and took a big bite, chewing vigorously as if afraid someone might snatch it away at any moment. JD sat quietly, allowing her to savor that moment. Midway through the meal, the little girl paused, took a sip of her milk, and then suddenly looked up. "Sir, why are you being so kind to me?" JD met her gaze steadily, his voice low. "Because you had the courage to ask for help." Emily tilted her head, frowning as though deep in thought. "But most people never care." JD sighed and ran his hand lightly along the edge of the wooden table. "That's not entirely true. Many people want to help, but they just don't know where to start." Emily nodded, yet her eyes still held a trace of skepticism, as if the world had taught her that kindness always came with strings attached. A few minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the clinking of dishes and the scattered conversations around them. Then the little girl whispered, "Things weren't like this before." JD looked up. "What do you mean?" Emily pushed a fry around on the plate, her small voice heavy with sorrow. "When my dad was still working, our home was proper. I even had my own bed." Pausing briefly, she continued. "Then he left, and everything fell apart." The little girl didn't say any more, and JD didn't press further. But he could sense the gaps in her story from the way her shoulders slumped and her eyes avoided his, as though the pain had become a part of her. He knew that to hear it all, he would have to wait patiently for her to trust him. Sitting there, watching the little girl intently, JD realized that helping Emily wasn't just about providing a meal. As dinner drew to a close, Emily slowed down, savoring the last few fries, her greasy fingers glistening under the light. The initial hunger had subsided, replaced by a resignation that JD understood well. She knew that behind this warm light lay a cold night and uncertain days waiting. He rested his elbow on the table and cautiously asked, "Your mom is at the support center, right?" Emily nodded, using a tissue to wipe her hands. "Yes, ma'am. Does your mom know you're here?" For the first time since sitting down, the little girl hesitated, her eyes drifting away. "Mom knows I'm out." Looking to see if anyone has left any food or spare change. JD took a deep breath, his heart heavy. He had seen this before. Children forced to grow up too soon, learning to fend for themselves in order to survive. Worries they should never have to bear. "Could you go back to your mom?" he asked. Emily's shoulders stiffened, her reaction unexpected and surprising. "If I go back now, Mom won't be happy." JD frowned. "Why is that?" The little girl bit her lip, her voice trembling. "Because Mom is so tired, she's sad, and nothing ever gets better." Those words fell like a cold stone, weighing heavily on JD's chest. Before he could reply, the main door of the diner burst open and a blast of frigid wind swept in. A woman stepped through, her disheveled black hair hastily tied into a ponytail, her oversized coat concealing her slender frame. Her eyes were sharp, glistening with despair. Emily immediately recognized her, tensing up and clutching the edge of the table. "That's my mom!" The woman, Sarah Miller, hurried over to the table in a few brisk steps, her face a mixture of relief and anger. "Emily, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." Her voice was sharp, but kept low as she reached out to pull the little girl close, not to hurt her, but to ensure she was still there. JD noticed Emily flinch slightly, her small voice timidly. "I was just eating a little." Finally, Sarah turned her gaze to JD, scrutinizing him. Sarah Miller stood there, her face set in a hard line in the dim glow of Tom's Roadhouse, her eyes etched with suspicion, mixed with tension. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice as sharp as a thin knife. JD Vance leaned back in the old wooden chair, his tone deep and calm. "I'm just the one who invited the little girl for dinner, nothing more." Sarah's jaw tightened, her eyes quickly scanning the empty plate in front of Emily, where a few scraps of fries still remained. A flash of embarrassment crossed her face, mingling with defensiveness and a hint of barely discernible gratitude. "The little girl shouldn't be bothering strangers," she murmured in a husky voice as if trying to hide her true feelings. JD shook his head gently. "No, she's not bothering anyone at all. She just asked me one little question." Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging as if a heavy, unseen burden had been lifted. As she stepped closer into the pale yellow light, JD could clearly see the deep exhaustion etched into her face. Deep lines like furrows, dark circles under sunken eyes. a weariness that no amount of sleep could erase. She turned to Emily, her voice softening slightly, yet still carrying a note of sternness. "You're not allowed to wander off on your own, got it?" Emily didn't reply, merely lowering her head further, her small hands clutching the tattered strap of her backpack as if searching for support. JD observed their exchange with careful attention before gently asking, "How long have you two been at the Community Support Center?" Sarah hesitated, her hand clenching into a fist before relaxing, as if waging an internal battle. "A few months now," she admitted in a dull voice. "I didn't want it to be this way, but it's all we have left." JD nodded, patiently waiting for her to continue. Sarah sighed. "I used to work at a packing factory not too long ago, for years. Then they laid people off. Everything just fell apart, and we ran out of options." Her words were brief and cold, not because she wished to hide anything, but because that story had been told so many times in vain. JD understood that spiral all too well. He had seen it everywhere. Homelessness doesn't hit like a sudden storm. It seeps in, bit by bit, through days of job loss, mounting bills, a broken-down car, until you realize you're sinking with nothing to hold on to. He exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to Emily, the little girl leaning against her mother as a silent reminder of the price of survival. "What if I could help you both?" JD asked, his voice calm yet full of meaning. Sarah's eyes flickered in surprise for a moment. "Help how?" JD nodded. "I know of a nonprofit organization here in Portland. They support families like yours, job placement, housing, everything you need to start over." Sarah looked at him, her eyes narrowing, not so much with suspicion as with the fatigue of hearing too many empty promises. "Are you a politician or something like that?" she asked, her tone laced with a hint of sarcasm. JD chuckled softly. "You could say that." Sarah rubbed her forehead and sighed heavily. "Listen, I don't need anyone's pity. She paused, swallowing hard. "I just need a way out." JD met her gaze squarely. "Then let me open that door for you." Sarah didn't respond immediately, but a glimmer of light flickered in her eyes. For the first time since she'd walked in, she allowed herself to dream of something better. Yet JD knew that persuading her to accept help wouldn't be easy. The air around the table still felt heavy, unresolved. Sarah studied JD, her eyes sharp, as if trying to find a flaw. She was too used to kindness always coming at a price, a harsh lesson life had taught her. Emily, still nestled against her mother, silently looked at him, her small hands gripping the edge of the wooden chair, a sight rarely seen when her mother was so hesitant. Usually, decisions were made hastily when there were no other choices. JD did not rush her. "You don't have to answer right now," he said evenly. "I just want you to know that you have another option." Sarah shook her head, still wary. "You don't understand. Those places, those programs, they make you jump through dozens of hoops proving you're worthy of being saved." Her voice was bitter, like an old wound being reopened. JD had seen that too many times, the way the system crushes people before even attempting to lift them up. "I promise you, this place is different," he said firmly. "They won't just toss you a temporary bed and call it a day. They build real solutions." Sarah rubbed her temple and exhaled deeply. "But what if I don't fit into their mold? What if they say it's none of their business?" JD leaned forward, placing his elbow on the table. "I won't let that happen." She looked at him, really looked this time, as if trying to read every thought in his mind. "Why do you care?" JD maintained eye contact, because once someone cared about me, and it changed everything. His words fell heavy, like a vow. Emily looked up, her tired eyes lighting up with a spark of curiosity. JD said no more. This wasn't the time to talk about himself. The important thing was to make her believe that these weren't empty words. But before Sarah could speak, a voice rang out from behind the bar. "Excuse me, sir." JD turned to face a middle-aged man with broad shoulders, rough hands, and a police badge peeking from his belt. Emily stiffened, and so did Sarah. The officer asked in a measured tone, "Is everything all right?" JD's jaw tightened. He immediately understood what was happening. A poor-looking woman and a child sitting with a well-dressed man in this diner, a scene that would undoubtedly draw whispers. Before he could reply, Sarah sprang up, her voice icy. "We're fine, thank you." The defensiveness in her tone was as sharp as a knife, honed by too many interrogations. The officer lingered, his gaze shifting to JD. "Sir?" JD maintained his composure. "I already said we're fine." The officer hesitated, then nodded slowly and walked away. Emily let out a soft sigh, as if escaping a familiar judgmental gaze. Sarah shook her head. "See? That's why I hate accepting help," she whispered. "They look at us like trash before even asking our names." JD let her words settle. She was right, but that didn't mean she should give up. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook and a pen, quickly scribbling a series of numbers, tearing the paper and sliding it across the table. "This is the number for that organization. If you change your mind, just call. Say I sent you." Sarah hesitated, then took the paper, her eyes wavering. JD wasn't sure she would use it, but at least she had another option. As he stood up to leave, Emily's voice rang out. "Uncle, wait a minute." He turned back, looking down at the little girl. Her question was so soft he almost didn't hear it, but her eyes, curious, weary, and yearning for answers, made him pause. Sarah shifted in her chair, her eyes flickering between them, but she didn't stop the child from asking. JD exhaled, pulling his coat tighter. "I grew up in a place no different from Portland. My family was poor. There were nights we didn't have a scrap of bread. My mother, she had to fight so hard." JD Vance paused, his eyes deep and resolute, as if piercing through the cold, lonely night of Portland. "I grew up waiting day after day for someone to notice, someone who cared enough to change everything." Emily sat across from him, her tiny fingers fiddling with the frayed strap of her backpack, her big eyes gleaming with a hint of curiosity. "And did anyone?" the little girl asked, her voice as soft as a breeze drifting through the glass door of Tom's Roadhouse. JD nodded slowly. "Yes, a few people. But there was one special person." Memories surged over him, as vivid as if he were standing in his grandmother's tiny kitchen, the rich aroma of strong coffee mingling with the burnt scent of toast. His grandmother's sharp gaze every time he'd sneak out of school. She didn't have much, but she always kept him fed and instilled in him the belief that he could overcome. Sarah Miller, Emily's mother, swallowed hard, her voice hoarse. "So, did you manage to get out?" JD hesitated, his eyes momentarily distant. "Yes, but not without a price," he replied. It wasn't something he usually talked about. People only saw him in his elegant suit, his dazzling title and brilliant success, but they never saw the nights he lay curled up, wondering if that vicious cycle would ever let him go. Emily leaned back in her chair, her small hands clasped tightly, as if weighing every word he said. The little girl had lived long enough to know that not every story ends in light. Sarah rubbed her hands together. The warmth of that gesture was not enough to chase away the cold that had seeped into her bones. "It's not that I don't want to accept help," she said, her voice softer now, the initial harshness eased. "But every time I think we're about to get on our feet, life delivers another knockout blow." JD nodded, his eyes gentle yet understanding. He had seen that scene too many times, the people standing precariously on the brink of hope, too afraid to move forward because of a past filled with wounds. "But what if this time everything changes?" he asked, his voice deep and heavy with meaning. Sarah did not answer immediately. Her eyes grew dim with exhaustion. She was too drained to believe in miracles. Just then, the heavy wooden door of Tom's Roadhouse swung open once more, its hinges creaking in the warm air. Two men entered, one a familiar police officer from before, and the other in a gray suit, his eyes sharp as knives. They murmured something before all their gazes converged on JD's table. Emily instantly stiffened, as if turned to stone. JD understood in an instant what was happening. Someone had called them over. The officer stepped forward, his tone measured. "Ma'am, we've received a report that a child might be in danger." Sarah's face turned pale, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" Her voice broke, panic spilling out like water over the edge. The man in the suit advanced, flashing his gleaming badge. "I'm from CPS. We just need to have a quick word." Emily's hand clutched her mother's sleeve tightly, her small fingers trembling. JD sprang to his feet before Sarah could react, his voice firm. "You've got it all wrong." The CPS officer pressed on, his eyes cold. "Are you a relative of the child?" JD's jaw clenched. "No." but I know something isn't right." The officer turned to Sarah, his tone even yet icy. "Ma'am, we just need to verify the situation. No one intends to take your child away." But that was the issue. The promise had been made too many times, and it wasn't always kept. Sarah's breathing quickened. She had broken out in a cold sweat trying to keep Emily by her side. "We're leaving right now," she snapped, gripping Emily's hand tightly. The officer stepped forward to block their way. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this." Emily's little chest heaved, her eyes wide with terror. She was used to being forgotten, not being scrutinized by the whole world. JD had only seconds to act. He had influence, power here, and he wasn't going to let them be torn apart. He pulled out his phone, his voice sharp as a blade. "Back off right now." The CPS officer frowned. "What did you just say?" JD stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. "I know exactly what's going on. You see a family in hardship, and instead of extending a hand, you're ready to tear them apart. Listen, if you dare take this further, I swear all of Portland will know your story." The officer fell silent. The police officer stepped back half a pace, uncertain. JD didn't blink. They need support, not punishment. "So, if you can't offer a solution, then get lost." A heavy silence fell, oppressive like the air before a storm. After a moment, the CPS officer sighed. "We'll be back later." He turned and walked away while the police officer lingered for a moment, nodding slightly in apology before following. Emily exhaled slowly, and Sarah's hands continued to tremble. JD set his phone down, his voice soft yet assured. "That's what I meant. This time, things might really be different." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time she nodded, even if only a faint nod. But JD knew that convincing her to trust in help was only the first step. The real battle was just beginning. Inside Tom's Roadhouse, the atmosphere seemed quieter after they left, yet the tension still hung like fog. Emily still clutched her mother's sleeve, and Sarah, though her face was deeply etched with exhaustion, held her child close. JD allowed them a moment of peace. He understood what it felt like to be backed into a corner, interrogated by strangers only to be met with empty promises. Sarah sighed, pressing her hand against her forehead. "I swear, it's like the whole world is just waiting for us to collapse." JD leaned in, his voice warm and low. "That's because no one should have to carry this burden alone." She managed a bitter smile, her voice tinged with sourness. "Then why do I always feel so abandoned?" JD didn't answer immediately. She was right, and he knew it. He took a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the worn wooden table. "I know the director of a family resource center in downtown Portland. This isn't just a shelter, it's a real program. A way out. They help with housing, jobs, childcare, anything you need." Sarah exhaled sharply, her eyes filled with skepticism. "I've heard that 100 times already." He didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a wallet, and placed a folded business card on the table, sliding it toward her. "No money, no charity, just a phone number. Call them. Tell them I sent you. You won't have to wait in line, and you won't be forgotten." Sarah stared at the business card, her fingers trembling before she picked it up. For the first time, JD saw a glimmer of light in her expression. Not complete trust, but the beginning of something like it. Emily, who had been silent until now, looked up and asked, "If we go there, will we finally get out of the support center?" Sarah swallowed hard and glanced at JD. This time, she didn't have to guess. "Maybe," she replied. Emily's small shoulders relaxed a little. Not a promise, but a glimmer of hope. JD leaned back, watching as the burden of survival seemed to ease, even if just for tonight. Just then, the waitress who had approached earlier came over hesitantly before speaking. The waitress stood by the table, her hands twisted together, her voice hesitant. I don't mean to intrude, but someone already paid for your meal." Sarah Miller's eyes flickered, her face stiffened in the pale yellow light of Tom's Roadhouse. "What?" she asked, her voice trailing off in surprise. The waitress tilted her head slightly toward the bar, where an older man in a faded flannel jacket sat, savoring the last sips of coffee from a chipped porcelain mug. He gave a slight, discreet nod before turning away, as if he wanted no attention. "He took care of it all," the waitress added. Sarah turned to look, just catching sight of the man standing up, draping his jacket over his shoulders and stepping out, leaving behind the biting Portland cold that swallowed his silhouette. She shook her head, her eyes clouded with confusion. "I don't understand this." J.D. Vance smiled gently, his eyes warming amid the gradually quieting din of the diner. "Maybe it was just a kind soul wanting to do something nice," he said, his voice deep like a comforting murmur. The waitress mumbled, clearly unaccustomed to delivering such news. And the owner said if you all come back tomorrow morning, breakfast will be on the house." Sarah looked at her, dumbfounded, as if the invitation came from another world, a world where unconditional kindness wasn't so rare. After a moment of silence, she let out a soft, choked laugh, as if she could hardly believe it. "So, that means I have no more reason to hesitate, right?" JD shrugged, his smile still in place. "I think so too." Emily looked up, and for the first time that night, her little face lit up with a radiant smile, like a street lamp breaking through a mist. Sarah stuffed the business card into the pocket of her worn jacket, rose from her seat, and adjusted the tattered fabric draped over her shoulders. For the first time in months, she wasn't leaving somewhere empty-handed. But JD knew well that this was only the beginning. Hope truly gains strength only when turned into action. The diner's door swung open, and the cold of the November 15th night hit them like a harsh greeting. The wind swept across Portland's sidewalks, sharp as a knife, but this time it carried a different feeling, softer somehow, as if a part of the burden on Emily's shoulders had been lifted, even if just a little. JD walked with them to the curb, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, not yet ready to turn his back and leave. Sarah exhaled slowly, her breath turning to white vapor in the air, her eyes glancing down at the sidewalk before looking up at JD. "I still can't understand why you do all this." JD studied her for a moment, his gaze calm yet sincere. "Because once upon a time, someone did that for me, and I've never forgotten it." Sarah furrowed her brow, as if that answer were too simple to believe. JD offered no further explanation. Some things need no words. Emily kicked a small stone that rolled about at her feet, the tip of her shoe drawing tiny circles in the concrete. "Do you really think they'll help us?" the little girl asked, her voice small yet full of fragile hope. JD bent down so his eyes were level with hers. "I believe that the hardest part isn't receiving help, but having the courage to believe you deserve it." Sarah took a deep breath and turned away, her trembling hands wrapping around herself. Perhaps because he'd hit a nerve, or perhaps because no one had ever addressed the issue quite like that before. The space between them fell suddenly silent, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the highway, the forlorn bark of a stray dog somewhere, and the neon glow from Tom's Roadhouse, pulsing like the heartbeat of the night. Then, slowly, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the business card JD had given her. She ran her thumb over the embossed letters, her breath seemingly catching, and before she could reconsider, she pulled out her phone. Emily watched with wide eyes, her breathing shortening as her mother dialed. JD didn't need to hear the call. He simply observed quietly, Sarah's shoulders relaxing as the voice on the other end picked up, her hands ceasing their trembling as she recounted her story, and her voice, for the first time that night, resonating with a hint of belief that things could change. When she hung up, Sarah spoke in a hushed tone, looking up at JD. "They said they'll meet us first thing in the morning." JD nodded. "That's good." Emily reached out to grasp her mother's hand, holding on gently. This time, the little girl no longer had to wonder what tomorrow might bring. JD pulled a bunch of keys from his pocket and walked back toward his car. His role in this story complete, the rest now theirs. As he opened his car door, Emily's voice rang out, "Uncle, wait a minute!" JD paused and turned back. The little girl hesitated, then stepped closer, her eyes lighting up. "Thank you so much, Uncle." JD smiled. "You're welcome, Emily." Sarah nodded in agreement, holding her daughter even tighter, as if fearing she might vanish. She wasn't completely convinced yet. Doubt still lingered, but she had chosen a path, and that meant everything. JD climbed into his car and started the engine. The rumble of the motor merged with the night. Tom's Roadhouse gradually receded in the rearview mirror, and the two small figures on the sidewalk faded away. But JD had a feeling he would hear more about them. Kindness sometimes spreads farther than we imagine, and a single small moment can change an entire life. If this story touches you, don't let it become nothing more than a fleeting melody that fades away. Look around. There's someone out there waiting for a helping hand, and all it takes is a little care. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. We'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.